Right now, let's finish up these notes before this goes on forever, right? Uh, so direct perception is where we're going to go next. Now, what is all this about? Um, so what do we want to think about here is I was kind of maybe hinting here and there about the sensation mediated theory leading us to some potential concerns about skepticism, right? That if perception is really about kind of encoding a signal and then the brain has to decode that signal. I also compared it to a process of translation where the senses are serving as a translator between the outside world and your perceptual awareness. Um, that always leaves open the possibility that we might want to doubt our translator or not trust the translator. And we talked about some issues of nominalism and skepticism and solipsism and all of that business. And so there is maybe a philosophical concern for that. But there's also maybe a concern that that theory of perception that takes us through so many steps is overly convoluted. And maybe there is a simpler perceptual theory that we could consider that also does not necessarily carry some of those skepticism concerns and doesn't kind of hint at dualism either. That's another kind of thing that shows up in that sensation mediated diagram is a distinction between physical on the left-hand side of the diagram and the psychological on the right-hand side, which implies a kind of mind-body dualism. And we had also talked at the very beginning about five problems in perception, and the fifth one is how perception is used to control action. And this theory that I'm introducing here, Gibson's direct perceptual theory, is in fact um, designed to address all of these questions, right? So it is really trying to eliminate any kind of mind-body dualism in perceptual theory. It's trying to eliminate any possibility for skepticism, and it's trusting that we can have a realist theory of perception, that we can perceive what's real. It doesn't require inference. It doesn't make the claim that perception is about constructing any kind of mental representation of reality. Instead, the claim is that, well, if you recall, we talked about the poverty of stimulus argument for perception, right? That individual sensations do not contain any psychological meaning, so therefore psychological meaning has to be imposed on them during some kind of internal processing state. And when we talked about Helmholtz's unconscious inference or even free energy principle. Um, all of that are examples of imposing meaning on the data and then testing and predicting and testing and so forth to make sure that hopefully moment to moment reality continues to be predictable and make sense. But Gibson's theory doesn't necessarily require that we have to always worry that our next moment might devolve into some sort of hallucinatory chaos, right? Because his claim is that it is incorrect for us to think about the sensory data as having no meaning. It is not impoverished. So earlier in the notes, I talked about the richness of reality and the richness of perception, but there is this challenge that sitting between them are things that are not very rich, this impoverished set of sensory data. That's the part that Gibson rejects here with his ecological approach. Why is it called an ecological approach? His claim is that when we think about our environments that we live in, that we inhabit, we usually think about things like what's out there that helps us survive, right? Food in the environment, shelter, and so on and so forth. But also, what's an important part of the environment is, according to Gibson, information. Light rays reflecting off of objects transmit and carry information about those objects. Sound waves emitted by sound producing events carry information about those events. So now Gibson's claim is that the patterns of light reflected from an object or the pattern of sound waves emitted from a sound producing event contain some sort of a structure that is unique to those objects and events. And because it is unique to those objects, that means it doesn't have to be interpreted. It is not ambiguous, right? So when we talked about the photograph of the railroad tracks, we talked about some ambiguity there. And Gibson's claim is that perception doesn't work this way. It doesn't start with these reduced retinal images. It actually starts in the environment. It starts in our ecological niche full of light and sound and all these other sensory patterns. And that's part of our ecological environment. It shaped how the sensory organs evolved, and it shaped how nervous systems evolved to detect and respond to that information. So in this case, the claim here is that we are not just information processors who are trying to decode the reality around us and construct a mental representation or mental image of the world. Rather, we are in direct perceptual contact with reality at all times, at least while we're awake, right? So in this case, we might say that that sensation-mediated theory could also be considered what we might call indirect perception because of that, right? But for Gibson, it's called direct perception. And so as I had mentioned here, Gibson's theory is also useful for helping us tackle the fifth problem here of how we use for perception. And so we've talked about this here and there throughout the notes already, that maybe there's two ways that we can perceive the world. One is about recognizing objects. I can look at things and name them, but much more important and perhaps even much more basic and fundamental is that I can look at things and then physically interact with them. And this may especially be true when we think about animal perception, because animals don't have language, and as far as we know, they don't have um, uh, representational thinking and names for things, right? So when animals perceive the world, they are not necessarily overly concerned about recognizing different kinds of things, perhaps, but maybe on just knowing and understanding how they can interact with it and what is something that is useful and is maybe should support what's called, we can divide behavior sometimes into approach and avoidance behavior. So we could say that if something is useful or has some value, then that would afford an approach response. But if something is dangerous or a threat, then that affords an avoidance response, right? And that term afford is important. That's a Gibson term here that refers to his idea of an affordance, and that when we are perceiving the world, we are perceiving immediately what it is I can do with the thing, separate from knowing what they are and how to name them. I am perceiving what kinds of actions I can perform, right? And so I've got my coffee ready this morning, and so even though I can look at this and tell you that it's a cup of coffee, even if I could not do that, I could still reach out, grab it, hold it in my hand successfully, and drink from it, of course. And as it turns out, when we move into some neuroscience here, this is where we have the Goodale and Milner findings. And, some of these findings actually go back even before their work, but what they have found here is that there are, in fact, two different kinds of pathways in the visual system of the brain that subserve these two different kinds of perception. Perception for recognition is goes through what is called the ventral channel here. Ventral refers to kind of like below or belly side of an organ, and that is what, when it comes to the brain, means coming down towards the temporal lobes. And so what happens here is that when visual information is processed in the occipital lobe in the back of the brain, this is where visual cortex is, um, some of these signals eventually get routed forward and down into the temporal lobes, where this area of the brain appears to be very, very important for recognizing and naming objects. What Goodale and Milner have shown is that sometimes with people who have brain damage, like a lesion from a stroke, for example, they have damage to that. We get agnosia. We talked about agnosias earlier in the notes, right? Regions that are, if are damaged, we see selective impairments in different kinds of categories of object recognition. But also, there is another mostly anatomically distinct pattern, or I should say, network of connections here, going from the visual cortex to the parietal lobe up the back side of the brain. So that's called the dorsal channel. Dorsal means back here. And The parietal lobe contains the somatosensory cortex that provides the body information. So it's kind of obvious to think that this is a pathway that helps interconnect visual and bodily information so that we know where we are in space, right? We can integrate vision and touch, hand-eye coordination. And then it might be obvious that we would be able to use this kind of processing pathway for moving around in the world, accurate spatial perception and movement. And we find evidence that if people who have damage to this area of the brain, they actually have no impairments with recognition, so that no signs of agnosia, but they do show signs of what's called optic ataxia. And optic ataxia is a movement disorder, but specifically it's a disorder of visually guided movement. So it's one thing that when with my eyes are open and I reach out and grab my coffee mug here, that I am looking the whole time and I'm watching my hand and I'm guiding my hand into place so that I know when I get it. That's a visually guided movement, right? But it's also possible sometimes that I can look at something, close my eyes, and then reach out for it. And I'm not going to try to grab my coffee cup like that. I might knock it over. But we can usually be reasonably accurate when reaching towards a maybe like a remembered location, right? And that shows really no impairment with optic ataxia. It's this online visual control that seems to show a lot of impairment here. So what this would suggest here is that for a person with damage to the temporal regions here, the ventral channel, recognition is selectively impaired. Their movements are completely normal. So they can reach out and grab things normally, and walk around normally, physically interact with their world normally. They just can't always access the names of things. On the other hand, someone with damage to the dorsal channel kind of has the converse set of impairments, right? Now they have difficulty physically interacting with things, but they can name everything correctly, right? And this is where Goodell and Milner's research comes in, because here they have a patient identified as DF, and DF has damage to the temporal lobe, to the ventral stream. And they gave this task, and this is an odd kind of a task here. I'm going to quickly grab my phone to serve as a prop here. So in this task called the posting task is what it's called. Um, it's like you're supposed to put a card in a slot, right? And so that's all you're supposed to do, except in one version of it, instead of putting the card into the slot, which is the posting task, it's called the posting task because it's just like mailing a letter, putting it in the post, right? Um, and one thing to keep in mind is that you see in this image that the slot is kind of diagonally tilted a little to the left away from vertical. But that's can be changed from a trial to trial basis. So they would randomly move it to different locations. Sometimes it would be vertical or horizontal or rotated to the other side and so forth. And in one version of the experiment, they asked DF to put it in the slot. And her performance on this task is actually quite normal. This is the bottom graph over here, labeled visual motor posting with DF on the left and control subjects on the right. And the degree to which you see any scattering of those lines indicates error and variation in her performance. And so she does have a slight increase in variation here relative to the control subjects, but it's fairly small and minor and not a huge impairment here. But look at the top two graphs here. What are we looking at? This is called the orientation matching task. So in this version, instead of having her put the card in the slot, they simply just asked her to line it up and just hold it there. All right. So in this case, that's the task, is to line it up and hold it. And maybe it's vertical or maybe it's horizontal, right? But that's all she has to do is visually align the orientation of the slot with the orientation of the card that she's holding in her hand. And in this task, all of that variation of those vertical lines represents her different judgments against what would normalize to be vertical as the accurate response here. So that means she's all over the place. She cannot do this task, right? It could be oriented as you see right here, but instead of getting it lined up just nice and perfect like you see in that picture, she might hold it the other way, right? And this is an odd finding if we think about it a little bit, because you would think, well, certainly isn't the ability to put the card in the slot a function of being able to explicitly compare the alignment of the card and the slot? And the answer apparently is no, right? Because she cannot do that, but yet she can easily put the card in the slot, suggesting again this kind of not just a perceptual dissociation or a task dissociation, but even an anatomical dissociation between these two kinds of perceptual information. And so again, that suggests that perception for action is kind of distinct and different from perception for recognition here. Um, One thing to think about here, we were talking about illusions earlier, and one of the things that we also see is that when people are physically interacting with these kinds of illusions, they don't their hand movements don't necessarily show the illusion, even though they might visually report that. What do I mean? So illusion D is the Mueller-Lyer illusion, right? And so again, the top line with the outward turned arrowheads is seen to be longer than the bottom line with the inward turned arrowheads, even though they are the same length. So if I ask a naive participant to tell me which line is longer, they will verbally report that the top line appears longer. But if I do a different version of the experiment where I let them look at the lines and then I have them close their eyes or blindfold them, and I have them put their finger on one end of that line, and now while their eyes are closed, I simply want them to trace the length of the line from one end to the other without looking, right? And if it was the case that the illusion was influencing this, you would expect them to move their hand a lot longer for the top line, and then when they've traced the bottom line by hand with the bottom line, it would be a shorter movement, right? But instead, they move the same distance in both cases, suggesting that at the action level, the perception is working just fine, right? And the same goes for illusion A. That's the horizontal vertical illusion. People report the vertical red line is longer. But if you trace them by hand, people make the same movement in each case because those two lines are the same length. In B, the two red lines are seen as kind of bowing out a little bit. But if you have people do a blind tracing task, they don't trace out a curved path. They go straight down. In C, another illusion. So the top line is seen as a little longer than the bottom. But again, these kinds of tracing tasks don't show that effect. And finally, in option E, the line is seen, those two red lines are in fact perfectly aligned with each other, but they appear to be kind of shifted a little bit. And you would expect then that if they were going to trace across, that they might kind of shift up as they do it, but they don't. So the claim here then is that, um, again, further dissociation between the way in which the perception for recognition pathways work versus the way perception for action works. One last thing to say about this. Yes, it is, in fact, the last slide finally. Some of this older research, even going all the way back to the really big research by Roger Sperry on blind sight. So in this case, what's happening is, so these were patients who had their corpus callosum severed because they had epilepsy, right? And so what's going on here is that when a focal seizure begins in one side of the brain and then it spreads across the cortex to create a grand mal seizure, generalized seizure, um, and it's not really treatable with anti-epileptic medications, antispasmodics, then sometimes we might have to resort to these kinds of surgeries that will prevent the seizure from spreading across the entire cortex. But this also then kind of prevents the two sides of the brain from working together as they might normally would. So behavior is generally relatively normal here, but there's a few odd things that can be discovered. So for example, you see in this setup here, this person who has had their corpus callosum severed is looking at two displays, right? One on the left side and one on the right side. So that means the information is making it just to one side of the brain here. So an object is projected as an image here through a projector. And if it is projected into the right side of their visual field, one of the things we want to understand here is that information from the right side of your visual field ends up on the left side of your brain. So what happens is that in this case, because language centers tend to be on the left side of the brain, the person can name the object, right? So they can say it's a ball or it's a cube or something along those lines. But if we flip it to the left-hand side, and that's what we're seeing in this particular drawing, now that visual information is now sent only to the right side of the brain where the language centers are not there, right? And because it cannot be transmitted via the corpus callosum over to the left to access those names, now our person struggles to name the object. But on the other hand, despite the fact that they can't name it, um, they can reach out with their hand and touch the different objects that are on the table in front of them, or maybe with their foot as well here. And they get a chance to feel around here, these different shapes on the table. They can't see them, but they can feel them, right? The hand is hidden behind this little occluder on the bottom. And when they find one that matches, they say, okay, even though I can't name it, um, I can tell you that this thing that I'm touching is the same as the object that's presented on the screen. So Sperry dubbed this blind sight because the idea is that the person is acting as if they cannot see. I don't want to say acting, behaving as if they cannot see because they can't name it, but they still have some recognition ability that relates to something related to the control of action. So again, blind sight kind of highlights a similar kind of dissociation between recognition for naming versus physical interactions. All right, now we are finally done. That was a good brief one, and that'll be it for this particular chapter on perception.